Are your enemies succeeding? Psalm 83. Divine prayer will confuse them the secret they fear. Are your enemies gaining the upper hand, leaving you overwhelmed and defeated? Too often, it seems like the odds are stacked against you, as if your every effort is met with resistance. But what if I told you there's a divine strategy, an ancient prayer written thousands of years ago that holds the power to overturn their plans? Psalm 83 is more than a poetic cry for help. It's a bold call to action that invokes God's justice and reveals a secret that your adversaries fear most. Confusion. This isn't merely about words. It's about activating divine power to dismantle their schemes, leaving them powerless in the face of God's intervention. The chaos you're experiencing in life, whether it's betrayal, toxic relationships, or situations beyond your control, isn't new. It mirrors the timeless battles contained within the Psalms, where the faithful stood against enemies far stronger than themselves. But they didn't stand alone. Psalm 83 calls for more than just strength. It calls for trust in a higher power who can turn the tide when all seems lost. The strategies of those seeking to harm you have limits, but God's justice is limitless. This prayer doesn't just ask for protection. It demands divine intervention to confuse and scatter the plans of those who seek to destroy you. Today, we're going to uncover the hidden wisdom in Psalm 83 that has defied the forces of darkness for generations. We'll explore how this divine prayer not only defends but empowers, how it brings clarity where there's confusion, and why it remains one of the most powerful tools against adversity. You'll learn why this timeless prayer still confounds those who seek to oppress, and how it can bring you victory over the battles you face today. What are your enemies planning? How can this prayer silence their schemes before they succeed? The answers lie in this sacred text, waiting for you to discover its meaning and unlock its power. You're not powerless. You are steps away from understanding the divine secret that your enemies dread. The emotional weight of Psalm 83. Psalm 83 emerges from a place of profound anguish, a cry for help in the midst of terrifying opposition. Its words were penned in an era when the threats were not vague or distant, they were real, immediate, and overwhelming. Enemies had united, conspiring against Israel with one shared purpose: to eliminate them entirely. The imagery feels heavy, as if the writer of the psalm can almost see the shadows cast by their foes drawing closer. Their cry to God is not one of resignation but of urgency and faith. O God, do not remain silent. Do not turn a deaf ear. Do not stand aloof. This plea cuts to the heart of human vulnerability, a raw moment where both fear and faith collide. It speaks to what it feels like to be surrounded, to be on the brink of collapse. And while the psalmist's words are thousands of years old, they carry an uncanny relevance for today. Because though the nature of our enemies may have shifted, the weight they place on our shoulders, the doubts they sow in our minds, that hasn't changed. The modern world is full of its own conspiracies. Workplace politics, personal betrayals, broken trust, manipulative systems, and even spiritual attacks. Aren't these the enemies we face every day? Whether big or small, these battles make us feel cornered. They rob us of our peace and, like in Psalm 83, they often come unexpectedly, seeking to destroy the very foundations of what makes us strong. That's the harsh reality this psalm confronts, a reminder that opposition is inevitable. Yet, despite that opposition, it also reminds us where to turn when the weight becomes too much to bear. As you reflect on the psalmist's cry to God, there's a stark honesty in their words. There's no fear in asking for divine intervention, no shame in admitting desperation. Do not be silent, they plead, because silence often feels like abandonment. But hidden within that cry is also a deep belief. God does not abandon his own. There's an unspoken thread of connection between the psalmist and God, recognition of divine faithfulness. Even in the darkest moments, that same faithfulness exists for you too. What's striking in this psalm is how the battles are framed. These are not random attacks. The enemy's hatred is intentional, their tactics are deliberate, and their goals are destructive. But this points to a valuable spiritual truth. Sometimes the battles in life are strongest when you're closest to fulfilling your purpose. The forces that oppose you often attack precisely because of the potential they see in you. Just as Israel's enemies sought to erase them, your struggles might feel like they threaten to extinguish your light. But this psalm reminds us of something powerful. What your enemies fear most isn't your downfall. What they fear most is your faith. That's why the psalm's petition to God is so bold. It doesn't ask for a vague response or subtle shifts in circumstance. It calls for visible, unmistakable action. Confound them, the psalmist says. Scatter them like leaves before the wind. This is a prayer that understands the limits of human effort. Its power lies in the recognition that God is the ultimate judge, the one who can expose lies, dismantle schemes, and protect his people despite all odds. Psalm 83 isn't simply a cry for deliverance. It's a declaration that when we feel outnumbered, someone greater stands for us. Think about the moments in your life when you felt surrounded. Whether it was an unfair accusation, a loss that felt undeserved, or a struggle that refused to relent, that feeling has no doubt left its mark on you. The psalm speaks directly to that experience, offering a path forward that isn't rooted in bitterness, but in trust that God sees what you cannot and fights on your behalf. This psalm frames your struggles not as meaningless chaos, but as part of a bigger battle that requires divine wisdom. Through its verses, a profound reminder emerges. You are not alone in the face of disappointment, betrayal, or hardship. Just as the psalmist called out to God in full honesty, you can too. This is a psalm of resistance, not by human strength, but by leaning entirely on the strength of God himself. When the psalmist invokes God's action, there's an important lesson for us. The call to not remain silent isn't merely about asking for help. It's about reminding us that God is neither deaf nor indifferent to what troubles us. His silence is not absence, but timing. Psalm 83 teaches us this. Even when the battle seems overwhelming, we fight by faith, trusting that God's justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. This chapter of the scriptures reveals the emotional weight behind every cry for help, but it also carries an undertone of victory that transcends generations. When you're in conflict, when the enemy rises against you, this psalm reminds you that your ultimate defender is a God who confounds those who seek to harm you and shields those who place their hope in him. The hidden pattern of resistance in the Psalms. Psalm 83 is a striking reminder that resistance begins long before the enemy's defeat. It begins in the heart and spirit of the believer. This psalm, like so many others, is more than a poetic expression of pain or injustice. It is a roadmap for how to confront adversity not with human strength alone, but with a reliance on God's divine strategies that echo through Scripture. Time and time again, the Psalms reveal a hidden pattern. When the faithful cry out in desperation, it is not an act of surrender. It is the first step in resistance. What makes Psalm 83 so profound is how it confronts the reality of oppression head-on. It acknowledges the strength of the enemy and the overwhelming nature of their plans. But at the same time, it refuses to give those enemies ultimate authority. This is the pattern woven throughout the Psalms: a refusal to let hardship define the story. The psalmist consistently balances the magnitude of the threat with the even greater magnitude of God's power. Here lies the first act of resistance, a shift in perspective. The psalmist does not minimize the problem, but instead magnifies the solution. Resistance in the Psalms, and particularly in Psalm 83, begins in the mind. The thoughts of fear and defeat that creep into our hearts when we face adversity are the same tactics used by the psalmist's enemies. They seek to dismay, confuse, and disorient. But the prayer of Psalm 83 turns this tactic on its head. It does not ask for strength to outwit the enemy. It asks for divine intervention to confound the enemy. This prayer is not rooted in human control, but in surrender to God's ultimate authority. The message is clear. You don't need to win the battle alone, because it is not yours to fight alone. Psalm 83 also reveals a crucial truth. Resistance begins with acknowledgement, not denial. The psalmist does not pretend the enemy isn't there. They do not suggest that the problem is small or insignificant. Instead, they lay the full weight of the threat before God. This act of honesty is itself a form of resistance, because it strips the enemy of their greatest weapon, isolation. The enemy often works hardest when you feel alone, overwhelmed, and unsupported. By bringing the battle to God, the psalmist resists the temptation to fight in their own strength, choosing instead to stand in the shadow of divine power. Another aspect of resistance in the Psalms is found in the language used to describe the enemy. The psalmist speaks of nations and alliances gathered with one purpose: to destroy the people of God and erase their very identity. This is not just a conflict of survival. It is a battle over purpose and legacy. In modern terms, our struggles often feel the same. Adversity, whether it comes in the form of betrayal, criticism, or personal failure, isn't just about the situation at hand. It attacks the very core of who we are and what we are called to do. Resistance, therefore, is not just about surviving the moment. It is about refusing to let the struggle redefine your sense of worth, identity, and purpose. The pattern continues when we examine how the psalmist involves God in the battle. This resistance is neither passive nor aggressive. It is active dependence. The prayer of Psalm 83 calls upon God to scatter them like tumbleweed. The imagery is deliberate, showing complete reliance on God's power to render the enemy powerless. The psalmist doesn't ask for personal vengeance or even earthly triumph. They ask God to take the lead, trusting that His ways are higher and His judgment is just. Perhaps the greatest example of resistance in the Psalms is the refusal to give the final word to the enemy. The psalmist acknowledges the urgency of the situation and the might of those who oppose them, but they do not dwell in despair. Every cry for help is followed by an expression of trust, an unshakable belief that God will act. Resistance is not about denying fear or pain. It is about standing firm in faith despite those emotions. It is about choosing to believe in God's ultimate justice, even when all visible evidence points to chaos. Psalm 83 also connects to a larger biblical narrative. The scriptures repeatedly show how God's people resist oppression through reliance on Him, not with weapons or schemes, but through obedience and faith. When Gideon faced overwhelming odds, his resistance began with trust in God's strategy, not in his army's strength. When Moses was called to face Pharaoh, his resistance was rooted in God's power, not his own ability. These patterns are mirrored in Psalm 83, where the psalmist models resistance by calling out to the only one capable of true deliverance. This hidden pattern of resistance isn't just ancient history. It's a tool for modern spiritual warfare. When life feels like it's closing in, battles can arise within your mind, pulling you into discouragement, anger, or despair. The lesson here is clear. Resistance starts in your spirit. Like the psalmists, you can acknowledge every struggle, surrender it to God, and choose to trust His plans above all else. Psalm 83 is not just a cry for help. It's a defiant declaration that no force of opposition will have the final say, not then, not now, not ever. The power of confusing the enemy. Psalm 83 is built on a remarkable strategy that is as relevant today as it was when first written: confusion. The psalmist doesn't ask for brute strength to overpower the enemy, or even for escape from the situation. Instead, they call on God to confuse and scatter their adversaries. This request is not accidental, it is profoundly intentional. It teaches us an important truth about how divine justice works and how God's intervention can nullify the most carefully laid plans of those who oppose us. To understand the power of confusion in this context, consider the precision of the psalmist's words. They do not seek to face their enemies on equal terms. They recognize that their opponents are greater in number and better equipped. Instead, they appeal to a power that transcends all human schemes: the ability of God to disarm the enemy's plans through chaos. The psalmist cries, "Make them like whirling dust, like chaff before the wind." In this image, the enemies are scattered, aimless, reduced to nothing in the presence of divine might. This isn't an act of destruction for destruction's sake. It's a strategic dismantling of the forces working against God's people. The concept of confusion as a weapon of defense appears repeatedly in Scripture. At the Tower of Babel, God used confusion to halt the arrogance of humanity and scatter the people's attempts to unite against Him. In the story of Gideon, God delivered victory to a vastly outnumbered Israelite army by confusing their enemies into turning on one another. Jehoshaphat led his people into battle not through conventional warfare but through worship. And as they praised God, their enemies were thrown into such disarray that they defeated themselves. This recurring theme shows something significant. Confusion is not just a reaction to chaos. It is a divinely orchestrated tool that dismantles opposition rooted in pride, deceit, and destruction. Reflecting on this truth, think about how opposition arises in your life. It often comes in calculated, deliberate ways. Adversaries, whether external or internal, do not approach randomly. Instead, they prey on your weaknesses, your fears, and your insecurities, meticulously crafting schemes designed to trap or defeat you. Toxic relationships manipulate your emotions. Workplace sabotage undermines your efforts. Anxiety whispers discouragement into your mind. These enemies, whether people or circumstances, seem to move with precision, striking you where you are most vulnerable. But the psalmist shows us something remarkable. These plans, no matter how methodical, cannot hold up under the weight of divine confusion. When God intervenes, lies unravel, schemes disintegrate, and enemies lose their sense of direction. What was once a relentless attack suddenly becomes disorder, as God turns the plans of your opposition against them. Confusion becomes a weapon of justice, exposing what is hidden and shifting the balance of power in your favor. Now, consider how this applies to daily life. When faced with opposition, we often feel the pressure to fight back with equal force. The instinct is to retaliate, outmaneuver, or defend ourselves through our own strength. But Psalm 83 reminds us that the greatest victories don't come from human strategies. They come from surrendering those battles to God. When you allow Him to take control, His methods often defy logic but deliver results far greater than you could imagine. Confusion, in this sense, is not simply a disruption. It's a divine intervention that cuts directly to the heart of the problem, leaving no room for doubt that victory belongs to God. The power of confusing the enemy extends beyond mere defense. It is transforming. Picture this: an enemy sure of their victory suddenly finds themselves at a loss. Their plans unravel, their confidence is shaken, their efforts become meaningless. But for you, the one relying on God, this experience is something altogether different. It's not confusion on your end, it's clarity. While the enemy stumbles through the chaos, God opens your eyes to His provision. He reorders the disorder around you in a way that only He can. What looks like chaos is, in reality, an active work of divine justice. This doesn't mean we are passive observers. Faith and prayer are active roles in participating with God's plans. When we cry out, "Confound them, scatter them," as the psalmist does, we are stepping into that sacred partnership, trusting God to move where we cannot. It is an act of faith rooted in the belief that human schemes will never outmatch divine sovereignty. In modern life, this principle is crucial. Relationships can break free from manipulation when God exposes truths that were hidden. Career hardships can suddenly shift when deceitful tactics are brought to light. Mental battles that once felt insurmountable dissolve when divine wisdom replaces confusion. Every circumstance that seems carefully calculated to harm you can be turned around in ways you least expect. When God confuses the plans of your enemies, Psalm 83 teaches that confusion is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of justice. It prevents harm, exposes deceit, and restores balance. It takes the power away from those who use it for destruction and places it back in God's hands. This is why the psalmist prays with such boldness and confidence. They know that while the enemy plots in secret, their God works in a far greater, unseen realm. And as His justice unfolds, those who have schemed against Him and His people are left bewildered, powerless, and defeated. This is the power behind Psalm 83's prayer of confusion. It calls us to stop wrestling in our own strength and instead invite God to move in ways that go beyond our comprehension. The moment we surrender to His wisdom is the moment the enemy's plans begin to unravel. How prayer becomes a weapon. Prayer is often underestimated. It's mistaken for a passive exercise, something that fills empty moments or serves as a last resort when all other options have failed. But Psalm 83 shatters that misconception. It shows prayer as something far greater, an unrelenting spiritual weapon designed to dismantle the schemes of the enemy. Through this psalm, we see that prayer is not simply a personal ritual, it is, in truth, a divine act of war. When the psalmist cries, "O God, do not remain silent, do not hold your peace or be still," they are not asking timidly. This is a plea from someone who understands the stakes, someone who knows that human power alone will never be enough to overcome the intricate and deliberate plans laid out by their adversaries. Prayer, here, is portrayed as the ultimate act of faith and surrender, but also as an urgent petition for God to rise and intervene in a situation that seems entirely out of control. What makes prayer such a powerful weapon is its ability to reach places untouched by human hands. You cannot always confront an enemy face to face. You cannot always see the extent of their plans or defend yourself against every invisible attack. But prayer reaches where nothing else can. In Psalm 83, the psalmist knows they are outmatched. Their enemies have gathered in secret, plotting, conspiring forces too numerous and coordinated to overcome alone. But through prayer, they lift the battle into God's hands, calling upon His unlimited power and wisdom, trusting Him to do what no human strategy could ever accomplish. The words of their prayer are not subtle. They do not simply ask for safety. They ask for the enemy's plans to fail entirely. They say, "Make them like chaff before the wind, as fire consumes the forest, as flames set the mountains ablaze." This is decisive language, reflecting the psalmist's confidence in a God who acts with authority. Prayer here is not submission to circumstances, it is participation in divine justice. A call for alignment with God's will to expose and dismantle the forces working against His people. Many of today's challenges may not involve literal armies, but the principle remains. Adversity comes in all forms: broken relationships, hostile environments, unforeseen obstacles. These battles often push us to take matters into our own hands, to fight with our words, our actions, and our strength. But Psalm 83 reminds us that when you try to battle on your own terms, your power will ultimately fail. True victory comes when you transfer the fight to the spiritual realm, where prayer serves as an unyielding force that engages heaven to act on your behalf. To see just how effective prayer can be, think about the pattern found in Scripture. When Daniel prayed amid Babylon's corruption, the spiritual forces opposing him were overcome by his faith. When Esther fasted and prayed, the enemy's plans to annihilate her people fell apart entirely. When Elijah prayed on the mountain, he called down fire from heaven that silenced every false god. In each of these moments, prayer wasn't wishful thinking. It was an active, laser-focused weapon calibrated to provoke divine action. In Psalm 83, we see the psalmist calling on God to wage a strategic battle against the enemy. But prayer isn't just effective because it calls for God to work, it's effective because it changes the one who prays. The act of prayer aligns your spirit with God's. It moves you out of fear and into faith, out of self-reliance and into complete dependence on His sovereignty. It sharpens your perspective, reminding you that your enemies, no matter how powerful they seem, are nothing compared to God. Prayer also brings clarity in the midst of chaos. While your enemies may plot and scheme, praying to God places you in a position of peace, knowing that the problem is no longer entirely in your hands. It shifts the burden, lifting the weight of the fight off your shoulders and placing it into the hands of the one who cannot fail. That act of surrender is itself a decisive victory. The truth is, prayer often confuses the enemy. Instead of reacting with anger or fear, you respond with faith. Instead of giving them more power through worry or aggression, you hand the situation over to the only power that matters, God's. But prayer isn't just about defense, it's also about taking the offensive. In calling for God to pursue them with your tempest and terrify them, the psalmist shows that prayer can set the enemy into disarray. It doesn't simply shield you from harm, it dismantles attacks at their roots. Prayer initiates a chain of divine actions that the enemy cannot stop or comprehend. It opens doors no person can shut and shuts doors no person can open. This principle applies even to the inner battles many people face today. Anxiety, depression, and doubt often function as enemies within, attacking your peace and undermining your faith. Through prayer, you gain not only God's presence, but also His insight, His strength, and His peace. You declare that your life is not governed by random forces or manipulative schemes. You affirm that your foundation is anchored in God, giving you the power to stand firm no matter how strong the attack. Psalm 83 teaches that prayer is far from passive. It is active, powerful, and rooted in the belief that God has the final word in every situation. It shifts the fight from the physical to the spiritual, where victory has already been secured. The psalmist doesn't suggest trying harder or doing more. They call for prayer not as a supplement to action, but as the very action itself. Whether in the psalmist's time or today, prayer remains the most effective weapon against any and every form of opposition. The secret your enemies fear most. Your enemies may appear bold, calculated, and relentless, but beneath their apparent confidence, there is something they fear, something they dare not acknowledge, but know deep down to be true. What they truly fear is not your failure, but your faith. Not your weakness, but your resilience. Not your silence, but your steadfast ability to stand in the promises of God. Psalm 83 reveals this with striking clarity. Their greatest fear is the God who fights for you, the one who can unravel their schemes in an instant and transform their efforts into nothing more than scattered confusion. The psalmist in Psalm 83 understood this truth profoundly. When facing overwhelming opposition, their prayer wasn't just a cry for survival, was an appeal to the deepest anxiety of the enemy. Cover their faces with shame, Lord, so that they will seek your name. At first glance, this plea might seem rooted in vengeance, but it's not. It's a recognition that the ultimate fear of those who fight against God's people is the realization that they cannot win against Him. The power of divine truth dismantles the very foundation on which their pride, deception, and schemes are built. The enemies described in Psalm 83 gathered with a singular purpose: to destroy, to erase, and to dominate. They form alliances against you, the psalmist writes, making it clear that their efforts were not accidental but deliberate and tactical. They were united in their destructive goal, but their fear lay hidden beneath the surface. Their arrogance blinded them to the fact that God, in His infinite wisdom, sees every plan, hears every word whispered in secret, and knows every strategy before it is carried out. And that knowledge terrifies those who act against Him. That same fear exists today. The relentless attacks you may feel, whether from external forces or internal doubts, aren't random. They are calculated attempts to weaken your faith, to break your spirit, and to render you powerless. But here's the truth you need to hold on to. Those attacks come because the enemy already knows what you're capable of when you stand with God. Their goal is to break you before you realize the strength that lies within you, the victory that has already been secured for you. It's not your weakness they seek, it's your potential they fear. When your enemies rise against you, it's often because they see something valuable in you that you may not yet see in yourself. They fear the calling on your life, the purpose God has placed in you, and the light you carry into the world. They know that as long as you stand in faith, their efforts are futile. They know that every scheme can be overturned in an instant by the God who confounds the wise and frustrates the plans of the wicked. And that fear of God, fear they would rather den echoes in every one of their attempts to wear you down. This is why resilience becomes your greatest weapon. The psalmist highlights a divine irony, the very plots designed to destroy. God's people become the means through which God reveals His power. The enemies are left ashamed, scattered, and powerless, not because of anything the psalmist has done, but because of God's intervention. Their fear is magnified when they realize their efforts only bring them closer to judgment and further away from victory. Think about your own life. The obstacles you face, whether from people, situations, or circumstances, often feel like insurmountable walls. But what lies behind those attacks? What motivations drive them? If you look deeper, you'll see that those pushing against you are often fueled by a kind of insecurity, an underlying fear that you'll become everything God has called you to be. Psalm 83 teaches us that these forces are not as strong or secure as they seem. They crumble under the weight of divine truth because their foundation is built on lies and pride. Your enemies fear your reliance on God because it makes you unstoppable. They fear your faith because it shifts the battle to a realm they cannot control. They fear your endurance because it proves that their strength is limited. When you refuse to give in, when you pray, trust, and persist, they are reminded of the one unchangeable reality they cannot escape: God's sovereignty. Look at what this means for the way you approach life. Every time you pray in the face of adversity, every time you choose hope over despair, you reinforce this truth. Your enemies may fight against you, but they will never overcome the God who stands for you. This is why faith is your greatest shield and your most powerful offense. It is why the enemy works so hard to sow doubt, fear, and discouragement, because your faith dismantles their plans faster than any human effort could. This secret, found in Psalm 83, is a reminder that the enemy's strength is always an illusion. Their confidence fades the moment you realize who is fighting for you. Their boldness falters when you call on God's name. What they fear most is your ability to lean on God instead of succumbing to their pressure. They cannot outrun the truth that God sees all, knows all, and acts on behalf of those who trust Him. Psalm 83 shows us that divine intervention doesn't only defeat the enemy, it exposes their weakness. It brings their motives to light and ensures that their efforts serve a higher purpose. What they meant for harm becomes the very stage on which God's power is revealed. This is the fear that drives their actions. It's the fear that their schemes will ultimately fail, that their darkness will meet God's light, and that their attempts to destroy will only deepen their shame. When you face your own battles, internalize this truth. Your enemies don't fear you, they fear the God who fights for you. Stand firm in that knowledge. Hold on to your faith, knowing that every attack reveals how much the enemy despises your potential. Keep praying, keep trusting, and keep moving forward. Because what they fear most is simply this: you realizing that with God, you've already won. A fresh take, the role of divine timing. Psalm 83 reveals a profound truth that's easy to forget when the weight of life's battles feels unbearable. God's intervention doesn't always happen when we want it to, but it always happens at the perfect moment. The psalmist cries out urgently, "Do not remain silent, O God," reflecting the frustration we all feel when faced with relentless opposition and what seems like divine inaction. This plea isn't unique to Psalm 83, it's the cry of everyone who's ever felt overwhelmed by challenges, waiting for God to step into their circumstances. But here's the hard lesson Psalm 83 teaches us. God's timing is divine, not human. It operates on a scale far beyond what we can see or understand. The silence of God, often misinterpreted as absence, is not a sign of indifference, but a part of His greater strategy. This is one of the most difficult truths to internalize, especially when we're staring down enemies, obstacles, or hardships that seem poised to destroy us. Yet the psalmist's faith reminds us that even in silence, God is present, and His timing is perfect. Imagine what it must have felt like for the psalmist as enemies circled, their plans advancing. The temptation to believe that nothing is happening, that God is unresponsive, must have been overwhelming. Yet, the act of crying out in prayer demonstrates something crucial: trust. The psalmist doesn't retreat, doesn't give in to despair. Instead, they bring their desperation to God, holding on to the belief that He is listening, even when it feels like nothing is changing. This trust, even in the waiting, is an essential part of the spiritual battle. Divine timing, as it is revealed through Psalm 83, is not about quick fixes or immediate answers. It's about God acting when the circumstances have aligned in ways we cannot see. The psalmist doesn't ask for incremental help or short-term relief. They call for total justice, for the grand unraveling of their enemies' plans in a way only God can orchestrate. This prayer reveals the wisdom of waiting on God because His solutions go beyond our immediate desires for escape or comfort. Instead, His timing brings lasting justice, not just temporary resolution. Take a moment to think about the battles in your life. How often do we grow impatient, believing that if God doesn't step in immediately, all is lost? Yet hindsight often reveals the opposite. Every apparent delay carries a purpose. Every moment of silence from God is preparation for an outcome far greater than we could have imagined. Waiting doesn't mean that God isn't moving. It means He is working behind the scenes, setting the stage for a victory that isn't just for us, but for His glory. In Scripture, this theme of divine timing is everywhere. Abraham and Sarah waited for years before God fulfilled His promise of a son, even when the situation seemed utterly impossible. Joseph endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before God elevated him to power to save his family. And Jesus Himself, when told by Mary and Martha that Lazarus was sick, waited days before going to Bethany, knowing that God's greater plan wasn't just to heal Lazarus, but to raise him from the dead. In each of these situations, God's delay wasn't neglect. It was preparation for a greater demonstration of His power. Psalm 83 speaks into this narrative. The psalmist recognizes the urgency of the threat. They see the enemies advancing, their schemes unfolding, but instead of taking matters into their own hands, they place the situation in God's care. This is a bold act of faith because it acknowledges something profound. Divine timing isn't just about when God acts, it's about how He acts. The psalmist isn't asking for a half-finished solution. They're calling for God to deliver total victory. A resolution so complete that the enemies themselves are brought to shame and turned back toward God. This trust in divine timing carries a powerful message for today. In a world that demands instant results, patience is often seen as weakness or passivity. But spiritually, patience is an act of strength. It takes great faith to stand still when everything in you wants to fight, when every instinct tells you to take control or force an outcome. Waiting on God is an intentional, active process. It means continuing to pray, to trust, and to believe in when everything around you seems to echo the enemy's lies that God has forgotten you. Divine timing also protects us from things we cannot foresee. How often do we look back on our lives and realize that the no we thought we received from God was actually a not yet? Sometimes the very delay we fear is a shield of protection, a way for God to guide us around dangers we couldn't see. In Psalm 83, the enemy's plans are described as cunning and united, designed to destroy. But when God intervenes, His timing dismantles those plans in ways the psalmist couldn't anticipate, scattering them like chaff before the wind, devastating them with His power. His response isn't just timely, it's perfect. The psalmist's plea invites us to reflect on how we handle our own waiting seasons. Do we try to take the battle into our own hands, or do we choose to trust God's wisdom over our own understanding? What Psalm 83 shows us is that waiting on God isn't passive, it's a form of spiritual warfare. It's proclaiming, even in the midst of chaos, that God's justice is worth waiting for, that His timing is worth trusting, and that His plan is far greater than anything we could try to orchestrate ourselves. In your moments of waiting, remember this: God's silence is never abandonment. It is the sound of preparation, the quiet before His response. Just like the psalmist, you're invited to cry out, to be honest about your struggles, and to lay the battle at God's feet. And in doing so, you're not giving up your fighting with the ultimate weapon, a faith that trusts in the perfection of His timing. Victory, though delayed, will always come in ways that reveal His power, His wisdom, and His glory. Gratitude as an offensive strategy. Gratitude is one of the most overlooked but transformative weapons you possess when facing opposition. While Psalm 83 calls for divine intervention and justice, there lies within it an implied response that shifts the balance of power in your favor. Gratitude. This is not a passive appreciation for what has already been done, but an active display of faith, trust, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Gratitude becomes your offensive strategy, and when wielded, it has the power to confuse your enemies, fortify your spirit, and deepen your connection to God. When the psalmist cries out for deliverance, they acknowledge something critical. The correction, scattering, and confusion of enemies are not acts of human triumph. They are acts of God's glory. Gratitude is born from this recognition. Before even seeing deliverance, the psalmist trusts that God's intervention will result in justice, restoration, and glory. This trust allows them to stand firm in the assurance of God's character, turning fear into an opportunity for worship. But why does gratitude work as a weapon? Think about the nature of opposition, be it external enemies or internal battles. Opposition functions like a machine, feeding on fear, discouragement, and doubt. Gratitude disrupts this process entirely. By shifting your focus away from the threats around you and onto the faithfulness of God, gratitude weakens the enemy's influence. Fear loses its grip when you start thanking God for what He has already done and for what He is about to do. Gratitude also reorients your heart and mind during battle. It reminds you who is ultimately in control. Picture this: enemies gathering, their plans calculated to attack you at your most vulnerable. Naturally, panic would seem like the appropriate response. But what happens when, instead of panicking, you begin to thank God? Instead of dwelling on their schemes, you begin to praise God for His promises and provision. Gratitude shifts your posture from defensiveness to confidence. It declares that the battle is already won, that their plans will crumble under God's sovereignty. Psalm 83 reflects this truth in its ultimate goal, that even the enemies of God would see and acknowledge His supremacy. This is the result of divine justice, but also the power of gratitude in action. When you remain grateful, even in the face of adversity, it becomes a testimony of faith that speaks not only to those observing, but also to the forces working against you. It proclaims that no matter how strong the opposition appears, your trust in God cannot be shaken, and that terrifies the enemy. Gratitude also positions you to receive clarity amidst chaos. It's difficult to see God's direction when you're focused on fear, bitterness, or frustration. But when you choose gratitude, even before deliverance arrives, you open yourself to a divine shift in perspective. You begin to see your battles less as barriers and more as opportunities for God to reveal His power. Gratitude clears the fog, reminding you of every past victory and preparing you for what lies ahead. Consider how this works in practice. When trials come and opposition feels unbearable, what would it look like to stop and say, God, I thank you not just for what you've done in the past, but for what you are doing now, and for how you are working this situation for good. That kind of declaration defies natural instincts. It declares to your circumstances, to the spiritual realm, that your faith is unshakable. It silences the whispers of doubt, because no enemy can stand when faced with true worship. What's more, gratitude is deeply tied to God's timing, as we explored earlier. Waiting for deliverance is one of the hardest spiritual disciplines, but gratitude transforms that waiting period into a weapon of endurance. Instead of asking, why hasn't God moved yet? Gratitude prompts you to ask, how is God preparing me through this? It puts you in alignment with His purpose, reminding you that His delays are never denials. They are divine preparation for something greater than you imagined. Gratitude bridges the gap, allowing you to press forward in faith even when you don't fully understand His plan. The power of gratitude goes beyond inner transformation. It actively confounds your opposition. Imagine you are the enemy, and every tactic you use to bring discouragement is met with thanksgiving. Every attack is parried not with anger, but with praise. It creates confusion because it's the exact opposite of a natural response. What was meant to cause you despair starts to fall apart when it leads you into greater faith and dependence on God. That's the power of gratitude as a weapon it turns every scheme of the enemy into fuel for worship, stripping them of their strength and reinforcing your spiritual armor. Gratitude does something else few other strategies cannot. Invites God's presence into your situation. Scripture is filled with examples of this truth. When Paul and Silas sat imprisoned, they began to sing hymns of praise. Their gratitude in the darkest of places led to an earthquake that broke their chains and opened the prison doors. When Jesus stood before Lazarus' tomb, before calling him back to life, he lifted his voice and said, "Father, I thank you." Before the miracle came, the gratitude, and when the leper returned to thank Jesus after his healing, it wasn't just his health that was restored, he was made whole, body and soul. Gratitude is your offensive strategy because it draws on a truth that cannot be shaken. God is faithful. Every time you thank Him, whether for a past victory or a future one new, place yourself in alignment with that truth. You step into His light, and the darkness that seeks to consume you loses its power. The enemy cannot operate in a space where gratitude reigns, because gratitude invites the presence of a God who has already secured the victory. If prayer is the spark that begins your resistance, gratitude is the fuel that sustains it. It is the declaration of faith that transforms battles into testimonies and defeats into victories. By choosing gratitude, even before the outcome of your struggle is revealed, you take hold of a weapon so powerful that it disarms the enemy at its core. Your gratitude is both your shield from fear and your sword against doubt. Every moment you choose thankfulness, you remind your enemies that they are already defeated, and you affirm to yourself that God's plan is perfect. His timing is intentional, and His victory is unstoppable. Practical tools for modern life: how to actively confuse your enemies. Psalm 83 is not just a historical cry for help. It's a blueprint for how to approach life's battles with purpose, faith, and strategy. As much as it emphasizes the need for divine intervention, it also reveals the tools you can use in your daily life to stand firm against opposition and actively confuse the schemes of the enemy. These tools are not rooted in human conflict, but in spiritual disciplines that disarm hostility, neutralize attacks, and ultimately align you with God's will. The first step is prayer. But not just any prayer that is fervent, bold, and specific. In Psalm 83, the psalmist doesn't offer a passive or vague appeal to God. They make a direct, urgent plea: do not remain silent, O God. Do not stand aloof. This is not a timid request. It is a declaration of dependency on God's power. The kind of prayer that acknowledges His role as the highest authority over all circumstances. Such prayer is like a focused arrow aimed directly at the heart of the problem. When you pray with this kind of boldness, you actively undermine the plans of your enemies because you invite God to disrupt their strategies in ways they cannot anticipate. Even in your quiet moments, when no one else sees your struggle, this is your most potent weapon: a conversation with the God who controls all outcomes. Equally important is the discipline of remaining silent in the areas where it matters most. Silence may seem like a counterintuitive strategy in the face of hostility. After all, when you're under attack, the instinct is to defend yourself loudly, to argue, or to fight back with words. But silence, when practiced in wisdom, can be deafening to your adversaries. It creates a space where their accusations, manipulations, and schemes lose their momentum. Instead of engaging with their noise, you step back, allowing God to fight battles that don't require your participation. Silence isn't weakness. It's surrendering control to the one whose strength surpasses any human effort. It forces the enemy to contend with the fact that no matter how hard they try, they cannot provoke you into abandoning your focus on God. Another layer of this strategy is praise. While prayer and silence disarm the enemy in spiritual spaces, praise confuses them outright. Think of the biblical examples of this principle at work. When King Jehoshaphat led the Israelites into battle, his army didn't draw swords, they sang. The sound of their praise sent their enemies into such disarray that they turned on each other, and the Israelites didn't even have to lift a weapon. This is the power of worship in the midst of conflict. When you praise God not after the battle is won, but in the heat of it to send a clear message, you're declaring that you trust the outcome to God, no matter how dire the situation may appear. Praise isn't just your defense. It's a statement of faith that destabilizes every negative force working against you. The brilliance of these practices, prayer, silence, and praises, that they don't require you to fight on the enemy's terms. They elevate the battle to a spiritual realm where victory has already been secured. They force the enemy to contend not with your human strength, but with the infinite power of God. And this is where confusion comes into play. Enemies, whether spiritual or physical, rely on predictable responses. Fear, anger, or retaliation often feed into their plans. But the moment you respond with prayer instead of panic, silence instead of rash words, and praise instead of despair, their strategies begin to fall apart. What they've carefully crafted to work against you no longer holds power, because their foundation is built on provoking a reaction that aligns with their intentions, not God's. In modern life, these tools can seem impractical at first glance. How does silence diffuse a toxic situation at work? How does prayer help when you're faced with relentless criticism? How does praise solve a financial or relational crisis? The answer lies in understanding that these tools are not meant to operate in isolation. They are actions of faith, designed to shift the battle into God's hands while protecting your peace and your purpose. Silence may not change another person's behavior immediately, but it changes your inner dialogue, keeping you grounded and preventing you from engaging in pointless arguments. Prayer invites divine wisdom, bringing clarity to decisions that seem impossible, and praise, even in the darkest of moments, shifts your mindset from victimhood to victory, reminding you of God's sovereignty over all things. There's also a psychological element to these strategies. Modern science supports the idea that gratitude, worship, and meditation reduce stress, lower cortisol levels, and increase mental clarity. This means that prayer and praise aren't only powerful spiritually, they affect your mind and body as well. When you practice these tools consistently, you're fostering resilience that allows you to navigate challenges with greater strength and focus. The enemy thrives on your confusion, exhaustion, and emotional instability. But these practices create internal stability, allowing you to face adversity without losing your sense of purpose. When Psalm 83 speaks of enemies being scattered like chaff before the wind or consumed like fire devouring a forest, it's a stunning image of what happens when you employ these tools. The enemy's plans are not just stopped, they're unraveled, undone, rendered powerless by forces far beyond their control. And you, standing firm in the disciplines of faith, emerged not just as someone who survived the battle, but as someone who grew stronger because of it. Finally, these spiritual tools remind you of the bigger truth. The ultimate victory comes not from your ability to fight, but from your willingness to trust. Every prayer, every moment of silence, every act of praise is a declaration that you believe in a God who fights for his people. These actions reaffirm your allegiance to him and your rejection of fear and doubt. The tools revealed in Psalm 83 aren't just ancient practices, they're timeless strategies. In every aspect of life, from relationships to career challenges to personal struggles, they remain as effective now as they were then. When you pray boldly, stay silent purposefully, and praise consistently, you are actively confusing the enemy while strengthening your relationship with God. In these acts, you align yourself with a truth that cannot be shaken. Victory belongs to the Lord, and through him, no enemy can stand against you. A prophetic declaration of victory when the weight of opposition crashes against your life, when you feel outnumbered, overwhelmed, or on the brink of collapse. Psalm 83 reminds us of a single, powerful truth. You are not fighting alone, and the victory is already secured. This is not mere optimism. It is the unshakable reality of the God who confounds every enemy, whose justice strikes in perfect timing, and whose power outlasts every human scheme. It is in this truth that we find our ultimate confidence. Your enemies may appear to have the upper hand at times, well prepared and relentless. You may feel like you're running out of strength, that prayers seem to go unanswered, that the silence of God proves his absence, but appearances lie. While they conspire in the open, God is working in the unseen. While they plot, he prepares. Even when their plans feel close to succeeding, you must remember that God holds the final move. Psalm 83 is a song of divine intervention, a cry for deliverance, and a declaration that God will always reveal himself as the ultimate judge and protector. Think about the psalmist's plea. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, that you alone are the Most High over all the earth. This verse isn't just a cry for justice, it's a prophetic declaration of God's supremacy. When your enemies rise against you, their objective is not just to disrupt your life, but to shake your trust in him. Their strategies aren't only rooted in defeating you as a person, they challenge the truth of God itself. But they fail to understand that every battle you face is not between you and them, belongs to the Lord. And in that, their plans are doomed to collapse. This is where your true strength lies, not in your ability to outmatch, outthink, or outfight your enemies, but in your willingness to let God take control of the fight. It isn't the loudest or strongest who triumphs, it's the one who holds their ground in faith, who dares to believe that God's word is faithful and his timing perfect. Psalm 83 teaches us that every attack is an opportunity. Every hardship is a stage where God's glory can be revealed in ways beyond human understanding. What was meant to destroy you becomes the tool God uses to elevate you. And what if, instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you decided to ask, "How is God going to show his power through this?" This shift in focus is how faith grows. It moves mountains, not because of your strength, but because it connects you to the one who created the mountains in the first place. The enemies you face might be strong, but their power is limited, rooted in human pride, fear, and deception. God's power, in contrast, has no limit. With one word, he dismantles their plans. With one breath, he confuses them. With one act, he brings you through what once seemed impossible. But make no mistake, your role in the battle matters. Scripture constantly shows us examples of those who stood in faith, even when victory was not yet visible. In Psalm 83, the psalmist shows us what this looks like, calling on God boldly, waiting with trust, and leaning into His promises. This is not a passive faith, it's a firm, active decision to believe that God is as faithful today as He was in the past. Remember the battles of Jehoshaphat, Gideon, or Moses. Their victories weren't achieved through human might, but through obedience, praise, and a willingness to let God lead. And He did not fail them. Your enemies fear faith, not because of you, but because they know what happens when someone stands unwaveringly in God's promises. It's not the size of your resources or the cleverness of your strategies that puts them to shame, it's your refusal to give up. Your persistence in prayer, your ability to praise even in the storm. When you stay planted in His word, enemies lose their strongest weapon, your own fear and doubt. Victory then isn't always about eliminating the challenge, it's about enduring it with faith intact, trusting that what the enemy meant for harm, God will use for good. And when the battle finally concludes, you won't just survive, you'll emerge stronger. Look back at past struggles. The things you thought would break you were the very moments that built your character, strengthened your perseverance, and deepened your faith in God. Psalm 83 doesn't just proclaim victory over the enemy, it declares transformation within you. This is the divine paradox. The very battles designed to destroy you leave you closer to God, more resilient, and more equipped to handle what lies ahead. As you live out the truths of this psalm, carry this final truth with you. God's timing is not late. His justice will not fail, and His power will not falter. Every scheme, every attack, and every hardship submitted to Him will result in your good and His glory. When you hold onto God's promises, you step into a victory that has already been secured. Let your prayer be, scatter them, O God. Confuse their plans so that your name is glorified. No opposition, no betrayal, no scheme can stand in the presence of God's unshakable will. So today, declare your victory. Speak it into your life with boldness. Stand firm, knowing that every enemy plotting against you will stumble. Every attack will turn into an opportunity for growth, and every moment of waiting is preparation for something greater than you could imagine. The God who delivered His people in Psalm 83 is the same God who stands ready to fight for you now. Walk forward in courage, rooted in the perfect love and power of the one who has never been defeated. Your battle is His, and His victory is yours.